Hello there! In this video series, I'll be explaining what property is, where it comes from historically, and why it's impossible. If you want to read a book that's about over 100 years old, I'll put a link in the description to Proudhon's book. But the videos I have here will be to explain the ideas with more modern words, so it's more understandable. So first of all, I should define property. Property is claiming ownership of land, buildings, factories, workshops, and other means of production. Most anarchists make the distinction between private property and personal property. According to most anarchists, private property is what I mentioned before: land and means of production. Personal property is your home, your toothbrush, your computer, your clothing and such. I'll not make that distinction. Basically, I would say that the word property has become perverted and the meaning of property and possession has become fused together. What they call personal property is what I would call a possession. That's something you possess. That means you have it, you use it, and you can in most cases take it with you to the grave. Part 2. Property as a natural right. Property is seen as a human right today. The right to property can be seen as the rights of man. In Article 2 it says, "The goal of any political association is the conservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety and resistance against oppression." In Article 17 it says, "Property being an inviolable and sacred right, no one can be deprived of private usage if it's not when the public necessity legally noted evidently requires it, and under the condition of a just and prior indemnity." As we see here, political associations have to ensure property rights, and also that you are not allowed to take private property since it's sacred. But then it says that you can take property if it's of public necessity. This is some kind of logical fallacy, but then again, it's an exemption to a rule. But this is not a rule, it's a right, and it's supposed to be an inviolable and sacred right. So if rights are universal, then how come you're allowed to break them? It is the same as Article 10. No one may be disturbed for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their manifestation does not trouble the public order established by the law. This means you can have any opinion, but you can't have any opinion that troubles the public order established by the law. This means that if you have an arbitrary lawmaker, any opinion can be deemed to trouble the public. This has been abused to persecute religious minorities and also political radicals. Part 3. The origins of property and property in the tribal ages. So I'll start with the tribal ages and move forward in time until the modern times. In Western society, in the tribal ages, there was no concept of property. It was first seen during Roman conquest, where Romans would designate areas to different commanders and soldiers to be property, where they could have slaves working in their estates. In the tribal areas, there were different structures of hierarchy. And I will not go into tribal structure in this video, but I will talk about property in tribes. Mostly, everything was commonwealth. This means that everyone owned everything. Most commonly, people were buried with what was seen as offerings or possessions. Mostly, this was clothing, jewelry, and weaponry. Housing was different in most tribal societies, but mostly there were common houses and different sorts of buildings where people lived. This means there was no such concept of property along tribals, but there were wars. What was taken from other tribes during wars was usually spoils of war, which were distributed between the looting tribe. Here is where wives come from, since women from others were captured and slaves were also taken from other tribes. So the only sense of property in tribal times have been slavery. Part 4. Property in feudal times. In the bottom of the feudal pyramid you had slaves. Slaves were owned by others who could do with them what they wanted. They were property. Serfs in areas were also property and needed permission from the local lords to even leave the area they lived in. Mostly, they did not decide who they married and where they lived. You should read up on serfdom. A lot of it ended after the Black Death, but in some places it went on to the 1900s. Under feudalism, everything in the given areas was owned by the lords, except for in the cities. In the cities, you had the burghers or bourgeois. You also had freemen during feudalism. These were people who were not serfs, but the general population was under serfdom. During feudalism, property could be owned and sold, and the right of property was enforced with military might and violence. Back then there was no police. Under feudalism, people did not use currency mostly, and there was little bartering. Mostly common folk had their societal roles and fulfilled them, which meant that there was little trade. But in the cities, there were currency and markets. Mostly they used silver or gold as currency, or other coins minted. With money you got the gentry, who owned houses, and with inheritance they could rent out spaces for free people who were labourers. Different countries had different situations. In England, feudalism ended after the Black Death and the Peasant Revolt. Here they started parliamentarism. As nobles started wanting more commodities from the burghers or bourgeois or gentry, they had to accumulate more currency. And after the plague, in most places in the Western world, the serfs demanded payment for work, because otherwise they could just leave and get paid for work. Workers became scarce, and therefore they could demand more. But after a while things returned back to the same order, and a lot of revolts were suppressed. Some Scandinavian countries had a feudal society until the 1800s. Just note that it's different from country to country. Suddenly people started having ideas of another society. They wanted rights. You can argue forever about the origins from Roman republics or whatever, and please correct me if I'm wrong about anything here. In Holland, they revolted against Spain because of high taxes and religious persecution. They created a republic. That republic won against Spain, and we had the Glorious Revolution in England after that. And then we had the Bill of Rights. Then the Americans made a revolution. And after the French supported the Americans, they bankrupted themselves, and then the French revolted. And this created a liberalist society that most Western countries have. Part 5. Capitalist societies. First of all, note that it didn't happen at the same time in all countries. In some countries it happened in the 1850s, some countries it happened early in the 1800s, and some countries it was in the 1900s. All people in many nations got the same given rights. What happened was that people basically all became freemen, and serfdom was banned. This made people angry about wage slavery, because the former lords now just did like the other gentry. Gentry is the rank of free people who owned property. They took rent for their houses and then paid the farmers. In some areas they distributed land from nobles. But even from the beginning, this has been unequal. Wage slavery is the situation that began after the end of serfdom, that you're bound to work for someone else to be able to survive. To get food, you can't grow food unless you pay rent for the fields. To get food, you can't just take fruits from trees without buying the fruits from the owner. You must get wages to be able to survive. But what gives the person the right to the land in the first place? The only justification is conquest by force, a conquest by forefathers or ancestors, which means that violence is the only true justification for that property. Now, with unequal footings for wealth, this meant the common folk still had nothing, but they, instead of having the former feudalist structure, now had a new structure. Now the most oppressing group of people are not lords, but they're burghers or capitalists or bourgeois or gentry. They only make a living out of owning property, whereas the owner of the product of the workers is not their maker, it's owned by the capitalists. This means that the worker does not make a product that they sell themselves. And what choice do you have to not work like that? Most people during early capitalism did not own anything. They rented everything. They had even less property to call their own than someone living in a tribe. It is the same today. Most people have debt, which forces us to work, and most people do not own property. Most people rent, and the ones who own homes are mostly in debt. And usually when the mortgage is paid, if you survive that long, you will go on your pension, sell the home and live off whatever you have left. This means that most people still don't have any property. This means that capitalism and the liberal system does not create opportunities for everyone. Instead, it has maintained the status quo where the only improvements in society have been social rights, commodities, and technological improvements. So this is all I got for this part. Next parts will be about why property is impossible. If anything is unclear about the history of property, please say so. And if I didn't clarify some things properly, please write. And I'll see if I can do something about it, because I really want this to be understandable for people. Also, if you have critique, that would be nice to get. Of course, constructive criticism is always nice to have, and if you don't have anything constructive to say, then okay, not much I can do about it, is there? Oh wait, if it's on YouTube, you're supposed to say stuff. Yeah, well, I don't really care about likes or dislikes, but if you know how to share things, that would be nice, and where people would be interested in things like this, that would be nice. Yeah, I'm just going to add some of the outtakes that I had, because English isn't my first language, so I make a few mistakes. But yeah, please write if there's anything else you would be interested in. I'm currently unemployed, so I have plenty of time to make videos. Property being an inviolable and sacred inviolable during feudalism, which were distributed between For example, blah, 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 blah.